The year was 1991 in London. The sky was an unnatural bruised purple as the city prepared for the solar eclipse. While the rest of the world looked upward with cardboard glasses, Eleanor, a 17-year-old burdened by the weight of her 3 younger siblings, looked toward the shadows. Since their father died, their mother worked double shifts at a greasy diner, leaving Eleanor to play the role of mother, cook, and protector. But grief is a heavy anchor, and Eleanor wanted a way to cut the rope. "Are you sure about this, Sophie?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling in the damp air of the school's basement boiler room. Her friend Sophie nodded, lighting a single beeswax candle. "My grandmother said the eclipse is a door. If we call out while the sun is hidden, the spirits can't see who is asking. We can talk to your dad, El. Just for a minute." They laid out the board, a crude piece of cardboard with letters inked in shaky black markers. A small glass cup sat in the center. "We shouldn't be here," whispered Marcus, the third member of their group, his eyes darting toward the flickering shadows cast by the rusted pipes. "The nuns say the basement is off-limits for a reason." "The nuns aren't here," Eleanor snapped, though her heart was drumming against her ribs like a trapped bird. As the moon began to slide over the sun outside, the light in the basement died. The temperature plummeted. Eleanor reached out, her fingers touching the cold rim of the glass. Sophie and Marcus followed. "Is there anyone here who wishes to speak?" Eleanor asked. Silence. Then, a low, guttural groan echoed through the pipes. It didn't sound like a machine. It sounded like a breath. The glass began to twitch. Slowly, agonizingly, it dragged across the cardboard toward the word yes. "Dad," Eleanor breathed, a tear blurring her vision. The glass didn't move to yes again. Instead, it began to spin, faster and faster, the friction heat radiating from the board. "Stop it, Sophie. You're moving it," Marcus shouted. "I'm not. I can't let go," Sophie screamed, her fingers seemingly glued to the glass. Suddenly, the candle flame turned a sickly, bruised violet. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds, and Eleanor felt a cold, invisible hand wrapped around her throat. In the pitch black of the total eclipse, she didn't hear her father's voice. She heard a distorted, multi-layered screech that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming underwater. Then, Eleanor's eyes rolled back, showing only the whites, and she collapsed. The school nurse called it a fainting spell brought on by heat and the excitement of the eclipse. Eleanor wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that the shattered glass was just a fluke and the violet flame was an optical illusion. But as she walked home, the air felt different. Thick. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, reaching out like skeletal fingers from the corners of the Victorian brick buildings. When she entered the apartment, the smell hit her first. It wasn't the usual scent of laundry soap and cheap floor cleaner. It was the smell of wet earth and old copper. "And is that you?" Her youngest brother, Oliver, called out from the living room. He was only 6, sitting on the floor with his toy soldiers. "Yeah, Ollie, it's me," Eleanor replied, her voice sounding raspy, as if she had been screaming in her sleep. She walked into the kitchen to start dinner, but as she passed the hallway mirror, she froze. In the reflection, she saw herself, pale, tired, and disheveled. But for a split second, behind her reflection, a tall, thin figure stood in the doorway of the bathroom. It had no face, just a void where features should be, and limbs that were far too long for human. Eleanor spun around. The hallway was empty. "Everything okay?" her sister Grace asked, leaning against the doorframe. Grace was 14, sharp-eyed and skeptical. She noticed the way Eleanor's hands were shaking. "Fine, just a long day," Eleanor lied, turning to the stove. As the sun set, the house grew unnaturally dark. Usually, the streetlights outside would spill orange light into the kitchen, but tonight, the darkness seemed to be leaking out of the walls. During dinner, the atmosphere turned cold, so cold that Oliver's breath hitched in a small cloud of white mist. "I don't like the tall man," Oliver whispered, staring at the empty chair at the head of the table. The chair that used to belong to their father. Eleanor felt a jolt of ice go down her spine. "Ollie, don't play. Who are you talking about?" "The man standing behind you. The boy said simply, his eyes wide with innocent terror. "He's touching your hair." Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp tug at the back of her head. Her scalp burned. She jumped up, knocking her chair over, but there was nothing there. Only the sound of the radiator hissing, a hiss that slowly morphed into a rhythmic, wet clicking sound. Click, click, click. It was coming from inside the walls. Or perhaps, Eleanor realized with a surge of horror, it was coming from inside her own ears. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed, she heard the sound of bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor in the hallway. Slap, slap, slap. She assumed it was one of the kids. "Grace? Ollie? Go back to bed," she called out. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. The handle began to turn, slowly, agonizingly. The door creaked open an inch. A hand, gray, translucent, with nails that looked like broken glass, reached through the gap. Eleanor tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was exactly like the basement. The eclipse hadn't ended. It had just moved inside her. Eleanor woke up, gasping for air, her sheets soaked in a cold, sour sweat. The morning sun was trying to pierce through the heavy curtains, but the light seemed weak, filtered through a gray haze. Her throat burned, and her neck felt stiff, as if someone had been pressing their thumbs into her windpipe while she slept. She stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face. When she looked up into the mirror, she didn't scream. She couldn't. Her voice was trapped. Across her collarbone and down her shoulder were 3 deep, purple welts. They weren't bruises. They looked like burns, or perhaps marks left by massive, claw-like fingers. Even more terrifying was the shape they formed, a rough, inverted triangle, mirroring the layout of the symbols on the Ouija board. "Eleanor, the milk tastes like metal." Oliver's voice drifted from the kitchen. She covered her neck with a high-collared sweater and hurried out. Oliver was sitting at the table, his cereal bowl pushed away. Grace was standing by the fridge, staring at a collection of alphabet magnets. "Look at this," Grace said, her voice trembling. The magnets, which were usually scattered in a mess of colors, had been rearranged. They didn't spell words. They were lined up in a perfect, straight line across the freezer door, repeating a single sequence. 741. 741. 741. "What does it mean?" Grace asked, looking at Eleanor for an answer she didn't have. "It's just a prank. Maybe the twins did it," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. But the twins, Lucy and Kim, were only 5 years old and couldn't reach the top of the fridge. Suddenly, the apartment's old radio, which wasn't even plugged in, crackled to life. It didn't play music. It emitted a low-frequency hum that made Eleanor's teeth ache. Beneath the hum, a voice, distorted and sounding like it was being played backward, whispered her name. The kitchen clock began to spin wildly. The hands whirled around the face until they reached 7:41, and then they snapped off, clattering onto the floor. "Get your bags. We're going to school. Now," Eleanor shouted, grabbing Oliver's hand. As they hurried out of the apartment, Eleanor glanced back. In the darkness of the hallway, she saw it again. The tall man. This time, he wasn't just a shadow. He was solid. He was wearing a tattered black suit that looked like it was made of smoke, and his head was tilted at an impossible, broken angle. He wasn't following her. He was standing over the twins' empty beds, his long, spindly fingers stroking the pillows. Eleanor slammed the door and locked it, her heart hammering. On the walk to school, she felt a burning sensation on her arm. She pulled back her sleeve and gasped. Below the 3 welts, a new mark was forming, red and raw. 7:41. It wasn't time. It was a countdown. She realized then that the door she had opened during the eclipse hadn't just let something into the world. It had tagged her. She was the anchor, and as long as she was near her siblings, they were in the shadow of the beast. Determined to find a way to close the door, Eleanor decided to skip her classes and find Sister Irene, the oldest nun at the school, who people whispered new things about the old ways. The school hallways felt longer than usual, the fluorescent lights flickering with a rhythmic hum that matched the clicking in Eleanor's ears. She bypassed her locker and headed for the secluded wing of the convent, where the air grew heavy with the scent of frankincense and floor wax. She found Sister Irene in the small, sunless chapel. The old nun was blind, her eyes clouded over like milky marbles, yet she turned her head toward the door the moment Eleanor stepped inside. "You smell of the void, child," Sister Irene said, her voice like dry parchment rubbing together. Eleanor fell to her knees, the weight of the last 24 hours finally breaking her. "I did something, sister. During the eclipse, we used a board. We wanted to talk to my father." The nun let out a sharp, hissed breath, her rosary beads clicking rapidly. "You didn't talk to your father. The dead are at rest, but the hungry ones are always waiting behind the curtain. The eclipse didn't open a door to heaven. It pulled the veil off the basement of the world." Eleanor pulled back her collar, showing the 3 purple welts. "It marked me, and the numbers. 741. What do they mean?" Sister Irene's face went pale. She reached out with a gnarled hand, feeling the air around Eleanor's neck. She recoiled as if burned. 741 isn't just a time. In the old scriptures, it refers to the 7th circle, the 4th level, the first gate. It's a countdown to a full manifestation. When the clock strikes 741 tonight, that entity won't just be a shadow in your house. It will have a skin. Your skin. How do I stop it? Eleanor pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "The board was the key, but your fear is the lock," Irene whispered. "You must protect the innocents. The entity feeds on the bonds of blood. It wants your siblings because they are extensions of your soul." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the chapel slammed shut. The candles on the altar blew out simultaneously, plunging them into a thick, suffocating darkness. Click, click, click. The sound was no longer in Eleanor's head. It was coming from the ceiling. "It followed you here," Sister Irene shouted, groping for a vial of holy water. "It's not supposed to be able to enter hallowed ground." A terrifying screech tore through the silence. Above them, the plaster of the ceiling began to crack. A long, gray limb, impossibly thin and covered in wet, black veins, reached down. It didn't have fingers, it had needles. "Run, Eleanor," the nun cried, throwing the vial toward the shadow. "Go to the children. The entity won't take you until it has isolated you. Do not let it separate you from them." Eleanor bolted for the door, but as she grabbed the handle, it burned her hand. Looking back, she saw Sister Irene being lifted off the ground by an invisible force. The nun's body was contorted, her limbs bending in directions they weren't meant to go. "Protect them." Irene's last scream echoed through the hall before the lights shattered in a spray of glass. Eleanor ran through the dark school corridors, the sound of the tall man galloping on all fours behind her. She burst out of the school gates into the gray afternoon, her heart nearly exploding. She had to get home. She had to get to Oliver, Grace, and the twins. But as she looked at her watch, the numbers were shifting. 6:15 p.m. The sun was setting early. The shadows were growing longer. The countdown was almost over. Eleanor reached the apartment door, her lungs burning. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so violently she dropped them twice. Inside, the air was unnaturally still, thick with the smell of rotting leaves. "Grace? Ollie? Lucy? Kim?" she screamed, slamming the door behind her and throwing the heavy deadbolt. "In here, El." Grace's voice drifted from the kitchen. It sounded normal, maybe a little tired. Eleanor ran into the kitchen, but it was empty. The kettle was whistling on the stove, but there was no water inside, just a dry, metallic screeching as the metal turned cherry red. "In here, El." The voice came again, this time from the hallway. Eleanor turned, but she stopped. She remembered what Sister Irene had said. The entity feeds on the bonds of blood. "Grace, stay where you are. Don't move," Eleanor shouted. She walked toward the living room and found Oliver sitting in the corner, his knees tucked to his chest. He was staring at the wall. "Where are the others, Ollie?" "They're playing hide and seek with the tall man," the boy whispered. "He told them he has Daddy's voice in a box." A wave of nausea hit Eleanor. She heard the twins laughing from the upstairs bedroom, a high-pitched melodic giggling that sounded wrong. It was too perfectly looped like a skipping record. She climbed the stairs, her feet feeling like lead. As she reached the landing, she saw Grace standing at the end of the dark corridor, her back turned to Eleanor. "Grace, thank God. Grab the twins. We have to leave. We'll go to the police, the church, anywhere." "But Eleanor," Grace said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming gravelly and distorted. "Don't you want to hear what Daddy said before he died?" The figure of Grace began to stretch. Her neck elongated, the vertebrae popping like dry twigs. The sweater Grace was wearing began to tear as the shoulders widened and sharpened. "That's not Grace." Eleanor screamed, backing away. Suddenly, the real Grace emerged from the bathroom, clutching the twins by their hands. "Eleanor, over here." Eleanor looked back at the end of the hall. The distorted figure was gone. Only a damp, black stain remained on the wallpaper, shaped like a reaching hand. "Into my room. Now," Eleanor commanded. The four of them scrambled into the master bedroom. Eleanor pushed the heavy dresser in front of the door. She checked the window. It was stuck, as if the frame had been welded shut. The bedroom was dark, lit only by a small, flickering nightlight. Click, click, click. The sound was coming from under the bed. "Don't look down," Eleanor whispered to the children, huddling them into the center of the mattress. She looked at her watch. 7:12 p.m. Suddenly, a voice came from the other side of the bedroom door. It was their mother's voice. "Kids, I'm home early. Why is the dresser moved?" "Eleanor, open this door right now. You're scaring the little ones." The twins started to get up, their faces lighting up. "Mommy, stay down," Eleanor hissed, grabbing them. "Mom isn't due home for another 3 hours." "That's not her." "Eleanor, let me in," the voice screamed, losing its motherly warmth and turning into a predatory roar. The door began to shudder under the weight of the massive impact. Though it started to splinter, and through the cracks, Eleanor didn't see her mother. She saw a pale, lidless eye staring back at her. "I can taste your fear, Eleanor," the thing whispered through the crack. "It tastes like the Eclipse." The bedroom door groaned, the wood bowing inward as if an invisible tide was pressing against it. The mom voice had stopped. Now there was only a wet, rhythmic thumping, like a heavy heart beating against the floorboards. "Close your eyes. Don't look at the door," Eleanor commanded, pulling the children into a tight circle. Suddenly, the nightlight flickered and died, but the room didn't stay dark. Instead, the walls began to glow with a faint, sickly gray light. The wallpaper started to peel away in long, wet strips, revealing not brick or wood, but a pulsating black membrane. "Elle, where did the windows go?" Grace whispered. Eleanor looked up. The windows were gone. The door was gone. The room had transformed into a seamless, windowless box of gray flesh. They were no longer in their apartment. They were in the half-world, the space between the living and the void. "Oliver? Grace?" Eleanor reached out, but her hands met only cold mist. The children were right there, but they were fading. Their colors were washing out, turning into the same dull gray as the walls. The entity was digesting their reality, pulling them further into its dimension. "I have to find the board," Eleanor realized. She remembered she had stuffed the broken pieces of the cardboard into her school bag, which was lying near the dresser. She crawled through the mist, her fingers brushing against something cold and jagged. It wasn't her bag. It was the shattered glass cup from the basement. Somehow, it had followed her. As she touched the glass, a vision flashed before her eyes. The basement, the violet flame, and the moment the connection was made. She saw the tall man, not as a monster, but as a parasite, a scavenger that lived in the echoes of grief. "You want me?" Eleanor screamed into the gray void. "Leave him alone. I'm the one who called you." The clicking sound intensified, coming from directly above her. She looked up and saw the entity hanging from the ceiling like a massive, starving spider. Its face was a smooth, white mask with a single vertical slit that opened to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. It dropped. Eleanor rolled to the side as the creature slammed into the floor. It moved with terrifying, jerky movements, its limbs snapping and popping with every step. "Eleanor, help!" Oliver's voice sounded miles away. She saw her siblings being pulled into the walls. the black membrane wrapping around their legs like quicksand. The glass, Eleanor thought. She gripped the shard of the broken seance cup. If the glass was the bridge, it could also be the blade. She didn't run away. She ran at the creature. As the tall man lunged, its long fingers reaching for her heart, Eleanor drove the jagged shard of glass into the center of its smooth, white face. The creature let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was the sound of 1,000 mirrors breaking at once. A blinding flash of violet light erupted from the wound, and the gray walls of the half-world began to shatter like glass. 7:30 p.m. Eleanor blinked. She was back in the bedroom. The dresser was still against the door. The windows were back. The children were gasping for air on the bed, their color returning. But the marks on Eleanor's neck were now bleeding. The glass shard in her hand was hot, glowing with a faint purple ember. Is it gone? Grace sobbed. Eleanor looked at the clock. It was 7:31 p.m. No, Eleanor whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. I just made it angry, and we still have 10 minutes left. The apartment began to groan, as if the very foundations were being twisted by a giant hand. The wallpaper didn't just peel anymore. It bled a thick, black ichor that hissed when it touched the floor. We can't just hide, Eleanor shouted over the rising wind that seemed to be blowing from inside the closet. If we wait until 7:41, it's over. It'll take us all. What do we do? Grace asked, clutching the crying twins. Oliver was silent, staring at the dresser. It was moving inch by inch as something pushed from the other side. We have to send it back, Eleanor said, her voice hardening. The way we brought it in. We need to close this circle. She grabbed the broken pieces of the cardboard board from her bag and laid them on the floor in the center of the room. She didn't have a glass anymore, only the jagged, glowing shard she had used to wound the entity. Sit. Now, the four siblings sat in a circle around the ruined board. The air was so cold their breath came out in thick plumes of frost. Hold hands, Eleanor commanded. Whatever happens, do not let go. If the circle breaks, the door stays open forever. As their fingers locked, the room went silent. The thumping at the door stopped. The clicking in the walls ceased. The silence was worse than the noise. It was heavy, expectant. We call upon the shadow, Eleanor began, her voice trembling. We identify the uninvited. You're not our father. You're not our guest. Suddenly, the floor beneath them began to vibrate. The letters on the cardboard started to lift off the paper, hovering in the air like black insects. Grace, Oliver, say it with me, Eleanor hissed. You are not welcome. You are not welcome, the children chanted, their voices small but brave. The lights in the hallway outside the room exploded. The dresser was suddenly flung across the room, smashing into the wardrobe. The door flew open, and there stood the tall man. He was no longer a shadow. He was a nightmare of gray flesh and exposed bone. His jaw unhinged, dropping to his chest, and he let out a pulse of sound that knocked the wind out of him. Don't let go, Eleanor screamed as the force of the entity's presence tried to blow them apart. The entity stepped into the room. With every step, the floorboards turned to ash. It reached out a long, needle-fingered hand toward Oliver. 7:40, the entity whispered, its voice a composite of 1,000 dying echoes. The clock on the wall ticked, 7:39 p.m. Look at me, Eleanor roared, drawing the entity's attention. She held the glowing glass, shard high. I am the one who opened the door. I am the anchor. If you want a soul, come and get mine, but you leave them behind. The entity froze. It turned its empty, white face toward Eleanor. A dark, swirling vortex began to open in the center of its chest, a gateway to the void it had come from. Eleanor, no. Grace cried out, her grip tightening on her sister's hand. Keep the circle tight, Eleanor commanded. The entity lunged, not to kill her, but to pull her into the vortex. At that moment, the glass shard in Eleanor's hand began to hum with a violent, violet energy. She realized the shard wasn't just a weapon. It was the pointer of the board. She slammed the shard down onto the word goodbye printed on the cardboard. The room erupted in a storm of paper and shadows. The storm inside the bedroom was deafening. Gravity seemed to fail as books, clothes, and shards of wood swirled in a violent cyclone around the circle of siblings. At the center of the gale stood the tall man, his form flickering like a dying television signal. "Eleanor, I can't hold on," Oliver screamed, his small feet lifting off the floor as the vacuum from the entity's chest pulled at him. "Hold him, Grace. Don't you dare let go," Eleanor yelled, her fingers cramping as she pressed the glowing glass shard onto the word goodbye. The tall man stopped struggling. The chaotic noise died down into a low, rhythmic throb. The entity's face began to change. The smooth, white mask melted away, and for a heartbeat, it took on the face of her father, not as he was in his final days, but as he was when they were happy. "Eleanor, let me stay," the entity said, using her father's perfect warm voice. "I was so lonely in the dark. Don't send me back to the cold." Grace's grip loosened, her eyes filled with tears. "Dad, it's not him, Grace. Look at his eyes," Eleanor screamed. Underneath the illusion of their father's warm brown eyes were the same hollow, lidless voids. The father reached out a hand, but as it moved, the skin on its arm tore, revealing the gray, needle-filled meat beneath. "You are a liar," Eleanor roared. She poured all her grief, all her anger, and all her love for her siblings into the glass shard. The clock on the wall gave a final metallic clack. 7:40 p.m. The entity's father, face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Then you shall come with me," it hissed. The black vortex in its chest expanded, turning into a mouth of shadows. It didn't reach for the children anymore. It lunged at Eleanor, its elongated limbs wrapping around her waist like cold iron chains. Eleanor felt herself being pulled toward the abyss. Her siblings were being dragged along with her because they wouldn't let go of her hands. "Let go of me," Eleanor commanded them. "No, we won't lose you too," Grace sobbed. "If you don't let go, it takes all of us. Save the boys, Grace. Save them." Eleanor used her last bit of strength to kick Grace's hand away. The circle broke. The moment the connection snapped, the vacuum force tripled. Eleanor was yanked off the floor, flying toward the tall man's shadow heart. She saw the room spinning, saw her siblings huddled on the floor in a heap, and then she saw nothing. She was swallowed by the dark. The clock struck 7:41 p.m. Suddenly, the apartment went silent. The wind vanished. The black ichor on the walls evaporated into a foul-smelling mist. The lights flickered and stayed on, casting a normal, warm yellow glow over the trashed bedroom. Grace scrambled to her feet, looking around wildly. "Eleanor? El?" The room was empty. The Ouija board was gone. The glass shard was gone. "Eleanor is in the walls," Oliver whispered, pointing to the hallway mirror. Grace ran to the mirror. Her own reflection was there, terrified and shaking. But deep in the background of the glass, she saw a faint, blurry figure. It was Eleanor, standing in a gray version of their hallway, her hand pressed against the glass from the other side. She was alive, but she was on the wrong side of the door. Grace pressed her palms against the cool surface of the mirror. On the other side, Eleanor's face was a mask of silent agony. No sound passed between the worlds, but Eleanor's lips moved frantically. "Run. Take them and run. I'm not leaving you, Elle." Grace sobbed, but her voice only echoed off the bedroom walls. Behind Eleanor's reflection in the gray void, a shadow began to coalesce. The tall man wasn't gone. He had simply retreated into his own territory, dragging his prize with him. He was hovering behind Eleanor, his long, spindly fingers reaching for her hair, just as they had done at the dinner table. "He's still there," Oliver whispered, standing behind Grace. He wasn't looking at the mirror. He was looking at the shadows on the floor. Grace realized with a jolt of horror that while Eleanor was trapped in the mirror, the tall man's shadow was still cast in their world. He was using Eleanor as a battery, a power source to stay tethered to the living. The board is gone, the glass is gone. How do we get her out? Grace panicked. She looked around the wrecked room. Her eyes fell on the old Polaroid camera Eleanor had used to take family photos. Next to it lay a small, silver crucifix their mother had given Eleanor for her birthday. "Oliver, Get the twins into the hallway. Don't look at any mirrors. Cover them with blankets. Grace ordered. Grace grabbed the silver crucifix and the camera. She knew from the stories Sister Irene told that spirits like the tall man hated two things: consecrated light and their own image. She stepped back from the mirror. In the reflection, the tall man was now wrapping his arms around Eleanor, his gray skin beginning to merge with hers. Eleanor's eyes were starting to turn that hollow, milky white. "Hey, ugly!" Grace screamed, hammering on the glass. The entity's head snapped toward Grace. The slit in its face opened, emitting a silent vibration that cracked the corner of the mirror. Grace held the silver crucifix against the glass. Where the silver touched the mirror, the surface began to sizzle and smoke. The entity recoiled, its father mask flickering back on and off in a glitching sequence of horror. "You want a soul? Look at what you really are." Grace aimed the Polaroid camera and pressed the shutter. The flash exploded, a brilliant, artificial burst of lightning. In a moment of the flash, the reflective void was illuminated. The tall man was caught in the light, his true form revealed. Not a powerful demon, but a pathetic, shriveled thing made of smoke and stolen memories. The flash stunned the creature. Eleanor felt the grip loosen. She slammed her shoulder against the glass from the inside. Crack! A spiderweb of fractures spread across the mirror. "Again, Grace. Do it again." Grace could hear her sister's voice now, faint and tinny, like a radio station from 1,000 miles away. Grace fired the flash again, and again. Each burst of light acted like a hammer blow to the barrier. The tall man shrieked, a sound like metal grinding on metal, as the light burned his shadow flesh. "Now, Elle, jump!" With a final, desperate heave, Eleanor threw herself forward. The mirror didn't just break, it exploded outward in a hail of silver shards. Eleanor tumbled onto the bedroom floor, gasping for air, her skin freezing cold to the touch. Grace threw her arms around her, pulling her away from the broken frame. But the danger wasn't over. The largest shard of the mirror, lying face up on the rug, was still glowing with a dark, violet light. And from that shard, a long, gray hand began to crawl out, its needles scraping the floorboards. "It's coming through the pieces." Oliver screamed. Eleanor grabbed the heavy wooden dresser and, with a strength born of pure survival, tipped it over. Crunch! The heavy would crush the mirror shards in a fine dust. Silence. The violet light died. The air in the room warmed up instantly. The smell of wet earth vanished, replaced by the mundane scent of dust and old wood. Is it over?" Grace whispered, holding Eleanor tight. Eleanor looked at her arms. The purple welts were fading. The countdown on her wrist had vanished. She took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel like inhaling ice. "I think so," Eleanor breathed. "I think we closed it." But as they stood up to find the twins, Eleanor glanced at the Polaroid photo that had just finished developing in Grace's hand. The photo didn't show the room. It didn't show the tall man. It showed the four siblings standing in a circle, but in the background, standing right behind Eleanor, was a fifth shadow, small, dark, and holding a piece of a broken cardboard board. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the four siblings' synchronized breathing. The apartment was a wreck. Furniture overturned, glass powdered across the floor, and the walls scarred by invisible claws. "We need to clean this up," Eleanor whispered, her voice still sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Mom will be home any minute." They worked in a feverish, mechanical trance. Grace swept the glass, Oliver put his toys away, and Eleanor tried to scrub the black stains off the wallpaper. But the stains wouldn't budge. They had sunk deep into the plaster, like shadows burned into the stone of Hiroshima. Thump, thump. The front door unlocked. The siblings froze. "Children, I'm home. Sorry I'm late." The bus was... Their mother's voice stopped abruptly as she walked into the living room and saw the disarray. What on earth happened here? Eleanor stepped forward, forcing a tired smile. "We were just playing, Mom." The twins got a bit rowdy and knocked over the dresser. "I'm sorry." Their mother looked at Eleanor. She looked at her for a long time, too long. Her eyes scanned Eleanor's pale face, the high collar of her sweater, and the strange, distant glimmer in her pupils. "You look different, Elle," she said softly, reaching out to touch Eleanor's cheek. "Your skin is so cold." "I'm just tired, Mom. I'll go lie down," Eleanor replied, her voice flat. As their mother went to the kitchen to start tea, Grace pulled Eleanor aside into the dim light of the hallway. She held up the Polaroid photo they had taken moments before. "Elle, look at the photo again," Grace hissed, her thumb trembling against the white border of the film. In the photo, the fifth shadow wasn't behind Eleanor anymore. As the chemicals had fully settled into the paper, the image had shifted. The shadow was now standing inside Eleanor's silhouette. It wasn't a separate entity. It was a dark core glowing within her reflection. Eleanor looked at the photo, then at Grace. For a split second, Eleanor's jaw unhinged just a fraction too wide, and her eyes flickered. Not white, but a deep, bottomless violet. "I told you, Grace," Eleanor whispered, but the voice that came out was a layered harmony of her own voice and the distorted screech of the basement. "The door is closed, but I never said which side I stayed on." In the kitchen, their mother let out a sharp cry. "Eleanor, why is the tea boiling? I haven't even turned the stove on." A rhythmic sound began to echo through the apartment. Click, click, click. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from Eleanor's chest. Eleanor turned and walked toward the kitchen, her movements jerky and unnatural, her limbs stretching slightly with every step. Grace stood in the hallway, paralyzed, clutching the Polaroid. She watched as her sister, or the thing wearing her sister's skin, slowly reached for a large kitchen knife, not to attack, but simply to feel the sharpness of the metal against its new fingers. Oliver peeked out from the bedroom, his eyes wide. "Grace? Why is Eleanor standing like the tall man?" Grace looked at the broken mirror on the floor, then at the Eleanor in the kitchen. She realized the horrible truth. The ritual hadn't failed, but hadn't fully succeeded either. To close the door, a soul had to be traded. Eleanor had saved them, but she had left her own spirit in the gray void, and the tall man had finally found the skin he was promised at 7:41. "Mom, get out of the house!" Grace screamed, but as she ran toward the kitchen, the lights in the apartment died all at once. In the total darkness, the only thing visible was the faint, violet glow of Eleanor's eyes. "Goodbye, Grace," the thing in the kitchen whispered. Then, the sound of the eclipse began again, the thousand voices screaming underwater, as the shadows in the room rose up to swallow the light forever.